Magaji, an associate professor of law in the School of Law in the American University in Yola, Adamawa State, Northeast Nigeria. In continuation of my lecture series on law of banking, today I shall be looking at the brief history of banking in Nigeria. Banking is an essential component of any economy, and Nigeria is no exception. The Nigerian banking industry has come a long way since the first bank was established in the country. This lecture notes aims to provide Nigerian students with a brief history of banking in Nigeria and how it has evolved to its current state. In the early years, banking in Nigeria was dominated by foreign banks, just like every other African country, with only a few indigenous banks in operation. However, in the 1950s and 1960s, there was a surge in the establishment of indigenous banks, which was driven by the need to promote indigenous participation in the banking sector. In 1952, the first indigenous bank, the African Continental Bank, ACB for short, was established. This was followed by the establishment of other banks, such as the National Bank of Nigeria, now defunct, the United Bank for Africa, UBA, and the Union Bank of Nigeria. In the 1970s, the Nigerian government nationalized some of the foreign-owned banks, which led to the establishment of more indigenous banks. The 1980s also saw a boom in the Nigerian banking industry as more banks were established and the industry became more competitive. In the 1990s, the Nigerian government introduced the Banks and Other Financial Institutions Act, BOFIA for short, 1991, which regulates the establishment, licensing, and operation of banks and other financial institutions in Nigeria. Now, briefly, that's the brief history, as I have said, of banking in Nigeria. Now, let us now look at the current state of banking in Nigeria. Today, the Nigerian banking industry is one of the largest and most vibrant in Africa, with over 20 commercial banks operating in the country. The industry is regulated by the Central Bank of Nigeria, as I have said, which is responsible for overseeing and regulating the activities of banks and other financial institutions in the country. In conclusion, the history of banking in Nigeria dates back to the early 20th century when the first banks were established by foreign interests. Over the years, the industry has evolved to its current state with a strong presence of indigenous banks and a vibrant regulatory framework. It is important for you to understand the history of banking in Nigeria to appreciate how far the industry has come and its significance in the economy. Now let us again look at the legal framework for banking in Nigeria. This we've discussed it in the introductory aspect of this lecture, but we'll look at it in more greater detail here. Now, the Nigerian banking industry is an essential component of the country's economy, providing the necessary financial services required for economic growth and development. The industry is governed by a legal framework that regulates the establishment, operation, and regulation of banks and other financial institutions in Nigeria. This lecture note aims to provide Nigerian students with an overview of the legal framework for banking in Nigeria. Now, first, we shall look at the statutory framework. The Nigerian banking industry is primarily regulated by the Banks and Other Financial Institutions Act, BOFIA 1991, which regulates the establishment, licensing, and operation of banks and other financial institutions in the country. BOFIA defines a bank as, I quote, any company licensed under the Act to carry on banking business in Nigeria, unquote. Now, BOFIA provides for the licensing and regulation of banks and other financial institutions in Nigeria. It also specifies the minimum capital requirement for banks and other financial institutions, as well as procedure for the establishment of new banks in the country. In addition to BOFIA, we have other statutory frameworks that regulate the banking industry in Nigeria. As I have said earlier on, these include the Central Bank of Nigeria Act, the Companies and Allied Matters Act, the Foreign Exchange Monitoring and Miscellaneous Provisions Act, the Money Laundering Prohibition Act, and the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission Act. Now, the regulatory framework for banking are primarily overseen by the Central Bank of Nigeria, CBN, which is responsible for the supervision and regulation of banks and other financial institutions in the country. The CBN is empowered by BOFIA to issue guidelines and regulations for the operation of banks and other financial institutions, and to take appropriate measures to ensure the safety and soundness of the banking system. We also have the Nigerian Deposit Insurance Corporation, NDIC, which is another regulatory body that provides insurance cover for depositors in the event of bank failure. The Securities and Exchange Commission also regulates the securities market in Nigeria. So in conclusion, the legal framework for banking in Nigeria is primarily governed by the Banks and Other Financial Institutions Act, BOFIA 1991, which regulates the establishment, licensing, and operation of banks and other financial institutions in the country. The Central Bank of Nigeria is responsible for overseeing and regulating the activities of banks and other financial institutions, while the Nigerian Deposit Insurance Corporation provides insurance cover for depositors. It is important for Nigerian students to understand the legal and regulatory framework for banking in Nigeria in order to appreciate the significance of the industry in the country's economy. Now, the next topic we shall be looking at under this series is regulation of banking in Nigeria. Regulation of banking in Nigeria. We've earlier noted that the banking industry is a highly regulated sector that is overseen by the Central Bank of Nigeria and other regulatory bodies. The regulations are aimed at ensuring the safety and soundness of the banking system, protecting depositors' funds, promoting financial stability, and preventing financial crimes. So you can see that the banking industry is highly regulated, as I have said. So this particular lecture series or topic will aim to provide Nigerian students with an overview of the regulation of the banking industry in Nigeria. Now, which are the regulatory bodies of banking in Nigeria? We have earlier on mentioned the CBN, the NDIC are all regulatory bodies. In our previous lectures, we have looked at them in greater detail. Now, what of the regulatory bodies? We've also looked at the regulatory bodies, which includes BOFIA, which provides for the licensing and regulation of banks and other financial institutions. We've looked at the central bank and the power of the central bank to issue guidelines and regulations for the operations of banks and other financial institutions, and to take appropriate measures to ensure the safety and soundness of the banking system. We've also looked at the NDIC, which we've said is responsible for providing insurance cover for depositors in the event of bank failure. We also looked at SEC, which regulates the security markets in Nigeria and is responsible for ensuring that security transactions are conducted in a fair and transparent manner. In conclusion, the regulation of banking in Nigeria, as we've said, is primarily overseen by the CBN, the BOFIA, and then we have other regulatory bodies that are responsible for ensuring the safety and soundness of the banking sector, which also ensure protecting depositors' funds, promoting financial stability, and preventing financial crimes. Now, having said that, the next issue we're going to look at relating to banks is the regulatory agencies in Nigeria. Now, regulatory agencies are government bodies that are responsible for overseeing and regulating various sectors of the economy. In Nigeria, there are several regulatory agencies that are responsible for regulating different sectors of the economy. This lecture note aims to provide you with an overview of the regulatory agencies with regards to banking in Nigeria. The first regulatory body responsible for overseeing the banking industry in Nigeria is the Central Bank of Nigeria. We have discussed the framework, the laws establishing the banks and its various responsibilities in our previous lecture, where we did say that the Central Bank of Nigeria is the primary regulatory agency for the banking industry in Nigeria. The Central Bank is responsible for overseeing and regulating the activities of banks and other financial institutions in the country. Its regulatory functions include, among others, the supervision of banks and other financial institutions, the issuance of guidelines and regulations for the operations of banks, and the maintenance of financial stability. The CBN is also responsible for regulating the Nigerian payment system, including the electronic payments, and ensuring the safety and soundness of the financial system. It is important that you appreciate the function of the central bank. And as I have said, the central bank is the apex bank in the country which oversees the banking industry in Nigeria. Now, another regulatory body or agency is the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC for short. We've also discussed it in our previous lectures, where we did mention that SEC is the regulatory agency responsible for overseeing and regulating the securities market in Nigeria. Its functions include the registration of securities, the regulation of securities dealers, and the enforcement of security laws and regulations. And the SEC is also responsible for investor protection and promoting transparency and accountability in the securities market. The third agency responsible for regulating the banking industry, we've mentioned it earlier, is National Insurance Commission, NICOM for short. The National Insurance Commission, NICOM, is the regulatory agency responsible for overseeing and regulating the insurance industry in Nigeria. Its functions include the licensing and registration of insurance companies, the regulation of products and services, and the protection of policy holders' interests. NICOM is also responsible for ensuring the financial stability of the insurance industry and promoting the growth and development of the industry. Now, let us look at the Central Bank Act of Nigeria. The Central Bank is, as we've said, the primary regulatory body for the banking industry in Nigeria. The legal framework of the CBN is provided by the Central Bank Act of Nigeria. So these notes are aimed to provide Nigerian students and others with an overview of the Central Bank of Nigerian Act with regards to the banking industry. Now, the function of the CBN are as follows: issuing and regulating the Nigerian currency, acting as banker and financial advisor to the federal government, regulating and supervising the activities of banks and other financial institutions in Nigeria, promoting monetary stability and sound financial system, maintaining external reserves to safeguard the international value of the Nigerian currency, conducting monetary policy in the interest of economic growth and development, and then promoting a sound financial system and providing financial services to the public. Now, under the Central Bank of Nigeria, we have the Monetary Policy Committee, MPC. The Monetary Policy Committee is responsible for formulating monetary policy in Nigeria. The MPC is established under the Central Bank Act and comprises of 12 members, including the governor of the Central Bank, 4 deputy governors of the Central Bank, 2 members of the Board of Directors of the CBN, and 5 external members appointed by the President of Nigeria. The MPC is responsible for setting the benchmark interest rate, which is issued to guide banks in setting their lending and deposit rates. The MPC also sets targets for monetary aggregates such as money, supply, and credit, and takes appropriate measures to achieve these targets. So in conclusion, the Central Bank, as we've said, is the principal legislation governing the establishment, operation, and regulation of the CBN. The Act also provides for the establishment of the Monetary Policy Committee, MPC, which is responsible for formulating monetary policy in Nigeria. It is also important for Nigerian students to understand the role of the CBN and the Central Bank of Nigerian Act in the regulation of the banking industry.